The house on Cardinal Road gave no warning, no broken windows, no signs of a struggle. The beds were made, laundry hung stiff on the line, untouched in the summer breeze. The milkman noticed the bottles had started to sour. Neighbors began to wonder why the Crawfords hadn't been seen in days. But there were no cries, no screams, just stillness. The kind of stillness that lingers after something terrible has already happened. Inside, everything was in its place. Teresa Crawford's purse was still on the kitchen table. The children's toys sat scattered beneath the television. A cup of tea had long gone cold, beside a half-finished crossword. But there were no footprints, no movement, no life. It looked like the entire family had simply vanished. But by the end of that week, 5 bodies would be discovered stuffed inside a car on the edge of a coastal gorge, and one man, the father, would be missing. It was no disappearance. It was execution. And it would go unsolved for over 50 years. Teresa Crawford was a devoted mother, organized, reliable, and gentle in her manner. She worked part-time as a nurse and kept careful track of her family's finances, appointments, and school schedules. She had 4 children: Catherine, 13, James, 8, Karen, 6, and little Matthew, just shy of 2 years old. Her husband, Elva Crawford, was quiet. Not the affectionate kind of quiet, the kind that kept everything beneath the surface. He worked as an electrician for the Victorian Parliament, a steady job with technical responsibility. He wasn't known to drink, and no one reported violence or loud arguments in the house. But Teresa had begun to grow afraid. In the months before her death, she started keeping a diary, brief, tentative entries. Nothing dramatic, but heavy with implication. She noted Elmer's secrecy, the way he would vanish into the garage for hours. She questioned missing household items, suspicious receipts, and boxes of electrical parts that had no business being there. She suspected him of fraud, of stealing from his job, and she had begun to think about telling someone. That decision would cost her everything. Elmer wasn't impulsive. He was deliberate, methodical. When faced with the risk of being exposed, of losing his job, his freedom, and his reputation, he didn't lash out in rage. He made a plan. Over several weeks, Elmer built a homemade electrocution device using stolen government components. It was rudimentary but effective, electrical wiring wound through copper tubing, designed to connect directly to the metal frames of the beds in his home. He had calculated the voltage. He had tested the connections. He was preparing to wipe his family from existence, quietly, cleanly, without anyone hearing a sound. On the night of November 30th, 1970, he waited until everyone was asleep. Then he got up and went to work. Teresa was the first to die. He likely crept into the bedroom, placed the wires against her temples, and switched on the power. The electricity surged through her skull and chest, stopping her heart in seconds. She never woke up. Then he moved on to Catherine, 13 years old. Her burns showed the same contact points, then James, then Karen. Finally, baby Matthew, just 20 months old, alone in his cot, killed with the same quiet, practiced efficiency. By sunrise, the entire family was dead. But Elmer didn't panic. He wrapped each body in blankets. He packed a travel bag. He folded their clothing neatly into the back of the Holden Kingswood station wagon. He loaded food and diapers, even brought along books and snacks. To an outsider, it looked like the Crawfords were going on a trip. And in a way, they were. Elmer left the house before dawn and headed south. The drive from Melbourne to Loch Ard Gorge took over 3 hours. It was a strange route for a family holiday, remote, windswept cliffs with little in the way of facilities. But it had one thing Elmer needed: height, isolation, and a history of tragic accidents. When he arrived, he parked the car near the edge of the limestone bluff. He had brought with him a second rig, another makeshift electrical device, wired to the car's starter system. intended to spark a fire or jolt the vehicle into motion. He planned to make it look like an accident, a tragic plunge off the cliff with his entire family inside. But something went wrong. The system failed. The battery didn't ignite. The car didn't move. Instead, it sat awkwardly behind a line of scrub, motionless and exposed. Elmer didn't try again. He simply walked away. A ranger discovered the car several days later. The bodies in the back seat were already decomposing in the summer heat. The children had been carefully arranged, wrapped in sheets, their limbs tucked as if they were sleeping. Teresa's purse lay nearby, untouched. Police were called immediately. The scene was too strange to make sense. The car had not been in an accident. The doors were unlocked. The bodies bore no trauma, no bleeding. But when coroners examined them more closely, they found burn marks, inconsistent with fire, more like electricity. Then the wires were found beneath the car hood, and the same wires, burnt and snaked, were found beneath the beds at the Crawford home. It was murder, planned, engineered, cold. Elmer Crawford had vanished without a trace. When police searched the house, they found a diary. Teresa's careful handwriting detailed her growing suspicions of Elmer's theft, of strange behavior, of money missing from their accounts. It became clear that Elmer had been embezzling parts from his job for months, maybe longer, building devices, hiding paperwork, and forging orders. He had also cleaned out the family's bank accounts in the days before the murder. He had planned to run. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in Australian history. Police issued alerts across state lines. Airports and train stations were checked. International partners were contacted. A warrant was issued for Elmer Crawford's arrest. But there were no sightings. Some believed he had fled to Ireland, his country of birth. Others thought he had taken his own life somewhere in the bush. A few believed he had never left Melbourne at all, just shaved his beard, changed his name, and disappeared into the gray static of the suburbs. There were leads. A man matching Elmer's description was spotted in Perth, another in Adelaide. None were confirmed. None led anywhere. Then the case went cold. Decades passed. The Crawford house changed hands. The cliffside was fenced. The Holden rusted and was eventually scrapped. But the story lingered. In 1994, the case was reopened with new forensic methods. A computerized age progression image was developed, showing what Elmer might look like in his 70s. Police pushed the story to the media, hoping for tips. Some came in, none panned out. Then, in 2008, a man died in California, a reclusive drifter known as John Vincent. He had no family, no paper trail, and had been living under assumed identities for years. Among his few possessions were a tattered Australian passport, old currency, and documents that raised red flags. When his fingerprints were sent to Australian authorities, they bore a near-perfect match with Elmer Crawford's. But it was too late. The man had been cremated. And with him, perhaps, the truth. What remains so terrifying about the Crawford family murders is not just the horror of what Elmer did. It's how calmly he did it. There was no frenzy, no spur of the moment. He built his murder devices the way he wired electrical panels, carefully, without emotion. He cleaned up. He packed snacks for the children he had just killed. He drove their bodies across the country like he was going on holiday. And then he vanished, with as little noise as he had made in their final moments. The case stands, to this day, as one of the most chilling family annihilation stories in Australian history. A father who murdered his wife and 4 children because he feared the loss of control more than he feared damnation. And somewhere out there, for decades, he may have simply lived on, watching the world forget. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. If you enjoyed this true story, join us next time, if you dare.